When ruthless HOA President Richard Hollis ordered the demolition of a food pantry for struggling families, he thought he was wiping an eyesore off the map. To him, it was just a nuisance. Never mind that it fed children, supported single parents, and kept people from going hungry. But what he didn't expect was the community fighting back, uncovering his corrupt backdoor deal and turning his own greed against him. 3 months later, the pantry stands stronger than ever, while Richard, he lost everything. Emily Carter's world shattered at 5:42 a.m. The phone call yanked her out of a dead sleep. She barely registered the caller ID, Kevin Sanders, one of the most reliable volunteers at the Maple Haven Community Pantry. But his voice? She barely recognized it. Emily, Jesus, Emily, wake up! They're tearing it down! For a split second, her half-asleep brain refused to process the words. Tearing what down? Then Kevin gasped out the next sentence, his breath ragged, full of panic. The pantry! HOA brought in a bulldozer. They're destroying everything right now! Emily shot up so fast, her vision went black. No, 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 no. She grabbed her phone, clumsily fumbling for her shoes with shaking hands. This had to be a mistake. The Maple Haven Community Pantry had stood for 5 years. It had fed thousands of families, handed out warm meals to struggling parents, packed school lunches for kids who otherwise went hungry. It wasn't just a building. It was a lifeline. Her jacket barely made it onto her shoulders before she sprinted out the door, keys clenched in her fist. She took the turns too fast, heart slamming against her ribs. Her mind raced, grasping for any explanation. Maybe Kevin was exaggerating. Maybe it was just a warning, not actual demolition. Maybe her car skidded to a stop. She sucked in a breath. Oh my God. The lot, her lot, was now a war zone. Chunks of cinder blocks and broken beams littered the ground. The old brick walls that had once held up shelves of canned goods, fresh bread, and donated groceries, gone. The industrial refrigerator, the one they had fundraised for 3 years to afford, lay on its side, door wrenched open. Milk pooled in the dirt, cartons of eggs shattered like broken promises. A metal rack jutted out at a sharp angle, barely hanging on, as if even the ruins of the pantry refused to let go. And right in the middle of it all, Richard Hollis, HOA president, local tyrant, wearing a pressed suit and a goddamn smirk. Behind him, the bulldozer sat idling, its metal jaws still dripping with destruction. Emily felt a roar of white-hot rage rise in her chest. She barely heard Kevin calling her name as she stormed forward, shoes crunching over shattered glass and splintered wood. What the hell did you do? Richard turned, slow and deliberate, like she wasn't worth his time. The structure was unauthorized. His voice was calm, as if discussing an overgrown lawn. It didn't meet the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. Aesthetic. Standards. Emily's blood ran ice cold. The Maple Haven Community Pantry had stood here for 5 years. Families relied on it, children relied on it, and Richard had reduced it to rubble. Because it wasn't pretty enough? Her voice shook. Do you even understand what you just did? Richard exhaled, long suffering, as if she was the one being unreasonable. Oh, I know exactly what I destroyed, he said smoothly, and I don't care. This isn't a homeless shelter. It's a community, and we won't have this kind of eyesore bringing down property values. Eyesore. Emily felt her stomach turn. Behind her, the gathered crowd was dead silent. Volunteers, parents, kids. All frozen in shock. A little girl, no older than 6, stood clutching her mother's hand, her wide, scared eyes locked on the place where she had eaten a warm meal just yesterday. Emily's breath came sharp, ragged. She saw it all. The elderly man who had come in for bread last week, whispering a soft thank you like it cost him his pride. The single mom with 3 kids who had broken down sobbing when they handed her an extra bag of food. The children who had laughed while picking out their favorite cereals because, for once, they had a choice. And now, all of it was gone, ripped apart, erased. And Richard? He looked proud. Emily clenched her fists so tightly, her nails bit into her skin. She took a deep breath. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The first news van arrived by 9 a.m. By noon, there were 4 of them, parked haphazardly along the street, reporters standing in front of cameras with grave expressions. Behind them, the wreckage of the pantry told its own story. Families gathered at the lot, their faces a mixture of shock, grief, and rage. Volunteers clutched at each other, whispering through tears. Some of them had spent years working in that pantry. And now, it was gone. The stories that broke hearts. A young mother, Lisa Monroe, stood in front of the cameras, holding her 2-year-old daughter on her hip. Her voice shook. "This pantry saved me last winter. I was barely making rent. I had to choose between keeping the heat on and buying groceries. And when I finally swallowed my pride and came here, do you know what happened?" She choked back a sob. "Nobody judged me. Nobody looked at me like I was a failure. They just handed me a bag of food. They told me, 'It's okay. Take what you need.' And now it's gone? Because some HOA president decided it was ugly?" Her little girl gripped the collar of her coat, resting her head on her mother's shoulder. She didn't understand what had happened, but she would, and the world would hear about it. Then there was Mark Rivers, a veteran, now in his 60s, who had relied on the pantry after a medical discharge left him struggling with bills. He stood in front of a reporter, jaw clenched, voice thick with anger. "I fought for this damn country. I put my body on the line, and when I came back, the world just left me behind. But that place, that little pantry, they never did. They made sure I had a hot meal, that I had groceries when my VA check didn't come in on time." He turned toward the ruins, his lips pressing together. And now, some asshole in a suit decided it was a damn eyesore? He wasn't alone. More people came forward. More stories spilled out. The single dad who had broken down crying when Emily handed him a Thanksgiving meal for his kids. The elderly woman who had come every week, not just for food, but because she had no one else to talk to. The teen who had volunteered every weekend, saying it was the only place he ever felt needed. Now, they all stood there, helpless, furious, devastated. And cameras were rolling. HOA members start to turn. By mid-afternoon, even people who had once stood with Richard Hollis were starting to break ranks. An elderly man named George Whitman sat down with a reporter, shaking his head. "I resigned from the HOA last year," he admitted. "Richard runs this place like his own little kingdom. It's never been about aesthetics. It's about control. He doesn't care about this community. He cares about power. And if something doesn't fit into his little vision, he crushes it. Hasn't I? That interview went viral within hours." Richard fights back. Richard, of course, doubled down. By the evening, the HOA issued a formal statement. They called the pantry a health hazard and an illegally constructed nuisance. Richard himself went on the news, sitting stiffly in a pressed navy blue suit, speaking in the calculated, rehearsed tone of a man who knew he had screwed up, but was too arrogant to admit it. The Maple Haven HOA takes community safety and neighborhood aesthetics very seriously. While we sympathize with those affected, this structure was built without proper authorization. Furthermore, we have reason to believe the operation was not legally registered and donations may not have been properly handled. Smearing Emily, trying to make her the villain, trying to make people forget what he had done. But it didn't work. Nobody was buying it. The backlash explodes. That night, a local activist started a GoFundMe to rebuild the pantry. Within hours, it had surpassed its goal. By the next morning, it had tripled. Lawyers started reaching out, offering their services pro bono. City officials, who had previously turned a blind eye to HOA politics, suddenly started paying attention. People were furious. And Emily? She was exhausted, grieving, angry. But she refused to back down. She stood in front of a packed town hall meeting that night, staring down the man who had bulldozed hope. "This wasn't just a building," she said, her voice firm but heavy with emotion. "This was hope, a home-cooked meal when there was nothing in the fridge, a warm coat for a child in the winter. Richard Hollis didn't just bulldoze a pantry, he bulldozed human decency." She took a step forward, eyes locked onto him. "And we're not letting him get away with it." The room erupted. Applause, cheering, people on their feet. "Richard, He sat stone-faced, arms crossed, but for the first time, there was something in his eyes that wasn't arrogance. Fear. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every aisle lined with volunteers, parents, struggling families, the very people Richard Hollis had crushed under his boot. And at the center of it all, sitting stiffly at the defendant's table in his tailored navy blue suit, was Richard himself. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't smirking. No cameras, no PR statements, just him, his lawyers, and the weight of what he had done. Emily sat across from him, her jaw tight, her heart pounding. This was it. The fight for justice had begun. The truth comes crashing down. The first blow landed fast. Emily's legal team had spent weeks digging through every permit, zoning law, and municipal code. And it turned out the Maple Haven Community Pantry wasn't illegal. The permits had been properly filed. The land was lawfully zoned for community use. And Richard, he had no legal authority to order the demolition. He had lied. Emily watched as the realization settled over the courtroom, people whispering, hands covering mouths in shock. Richard shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around the table's edge. And then came the knockout punch, exposing the conspiracy. The second lawyer stepped forward, holding up a stack of documents. They had uncovered something bigger: emails, contracts, paper trails. Richard Hollis hadn't destroyed the pantry because of aesthetics. He had been working behind the scenes with a real estate developer. The plan: flatten the pantry, buy the land cheap, replace it with luxury condos. He had profited off its destruction. The courtroom exploded. Gasps, outrage. A woman in the back shouted something unrepeatable. Even the judge, who had remained stoic throughout the hearing, visibly recoiled. Emily turned her head just in time to see the blood drain from Richard's face. For the first time, he looked rattled. Because now, everyone knew exactly what he was. The judge's verdict. The judge removed his glasses, exhaling slowly. Then he fixed Richard with a look so cold it could have frozen fire. "You ordered the destruction of a charitable food pantry," the judge said, his voice clipped with disgust. "For money." Richard's lawyer scrambled for damage control. "Your Honor, my client was acting in the best interests of the Homeowners Association. The structure was..." The judge held up a hand. "Enough." He turned to Emily's side of the courtroom. "The HOA is hereby ordered to pay for the full reconstruction of the Maple Haven Community Pantry," he announced. "Additionally, punitive damages will be awarded to cover all losses incurred by this illegal demolition." Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. They had won. And then, the judge looked back at Richard. As for Mr. Hollis, he picked up a final sheet of paper, one last damning piece of legal justice. Effective immediately, Richard Hollis is permanently removed from his position as HOA president. A pause. A heartbeat of silence. Then, the courtroom erupted. People clapped, some even cheered. A few hugged each other, relief breaking over them like a tidal wave. Emily sat frozen, barely breathing, as the weight of the past weeks of battle, exhaustion, and heartbreak crashed over her. She turned to the people who had fought beside her, the families, the volunteers, the community that Richard had tried to break, and for the first time in days, she smiled. Justice had won. The wind carried the scent of fresh paint and autumn leaves as Emily Carter stood before the new Maple Haven Community Pantry. It had been 3 months since the wrecking crew had reduced the old pantry to rubble. 3 months since Richard Hollis had smugly watched the destruction, convinced he had won. He thought he had buried this place. Instead, he had given it new life. The grand reopening, bigger, stronger, unbreakable. The new pantry wasn't just a rebuilt version of the old one. It was better. Stronger walls, reinforced shelving, a walk-in refrigerator that could store 5 times the fresh food they'd had before, a real kitchen where volunteers could prepare hot meals instead of handing out cold ones. It was no longer just a makeshift food bank tucked away in a converted storage unit. Now, it was a fully operational community center. The donations had come from everywhere. A retired veteran from Arizona had sent a check for $2,000, saying he wished something like this had existed when he was struggling. A group of college students from California fundraised enough money to buy brand new kitchen appliances. A woman from Chicago, who had once lived in her car with her 2 kids, donated a full truckload of non-perishables. The world had seen what happened, and they refused to let greed win. Emily ran her fingers over the shiny blue sign above the entrance. Maple Haven Community Pantry, rebuilt by the people for the people. It was no longer just a pantry. It was a monument to resilience. And the best part? Richard Hollis had to watch it all happen. The fall of Richard Hollis. While the pantry thrived, Richard Hollis crumbled. For years, he had ruled the HOA with an iron fist, treating the community like his personal chessboard. But after his exposed corruption, public disgrace, and courtroom humiliation, his entire empire fell apart. First came the HOA collapse. Without Richard, people began questioning everything. They dug into past budgets, discovered missing funds, and started filing complaints. Within weeks, the entire board had been replaced. Next came the neighborhood revolt. Richard had spent years treating homeowners like they were beneath him. Now, no one would even look at him. Restaurants refused him service. His own neighbors ignored him. His wife left him. That part wasn't public knowledge, but Emily had heard the rumors. Apparently, she had packed her bags the day the judge ruled against him. Guess she didn't want to be married to a walking PR disaster. But the real dagger, the one thing Richard loved more than power? Money. And thanks to the massive legal fines, the HOA being forced to pay for the full reconstruction, and the scandal-tanking property values, he was drowning. At first, he tried to sell his house quietly, but when the real estate agent showed up to assess the property, she took one look at the headlines and laughed him out of the room. Nobody wanted to live near him. And the irony? The very thing he had tried to stop, people he deemed undesirable from bringing down property values, he was the one who destroyed them. So, in the most poetic moment of karma imaginable. Richard Hollis, the man who had bulldozed a food pantry for profit, was forced to sell his house at a massive loss. When he left, there was no farewell party, no HOA members to help him pack, just a quiet, lonely move-out. He had spent years building his perfect little kingdom, and in 3 months, it had all burned to the ground. The moment of victory. Emily stood on the front steps of the new pantry, watching as the first families walked through the doors. The energy was different. Before, people came hesitant, ashamed, afraid that asking for help meant they were failing. But today, they walked in with pride, with relief. They weren't charity cases. They were part of something bigger. She watched a young father pick up a bag of fresh fruit and bread. A few feet away, an elderly man shook hands with a volunteer. Then, she felt a tug on her sleeve. Emily looked down. A little girl, the same one from that awful morning, the one who had stood in stunned silence, watching her world collapse as the bulldozer roared. Now, she held a small bag of apples in her hands. She looked up at Emily and smiled. "Thank you." Emily's throat tightened. She blinked back tears, glancing over at the thriving new pantry, the bustling volunteers, the sound of life returning. Then she turned toward the empty house down the street. Richard's former house. The for sale sign still stood in the yard. But now, the place was a ghost of what it had once been. No one mowed the lawn anymore. No one trimmed the hedges. His perfect, pristine world, abandoned. She let out a slow breath, and then, for the first time in a long time, she let herself smile. Richard thought he could bulldoze hope, but hope always rebuilds.